For some reason, that reminds me about a decade ago when one of my Jura PhD students put up a poster of Travis Bickle from Taxi, the scene where he's got the guns shooting out of his sleeves. You talking to me? Oh, maybe there was a message there for me as an advisor. Didn't slow me down much, but that student's now professor at the University of Iowa. We're going to talk about the history part. We'll take a break. We'll come back and see how far we get with the rest of it. Okay. So this is actually from starts with a chapter that Jim Buren and Schrutz, I think, did in one of the editions of the Handbook of Psych and Aging some years ago. And I was actually kind of surprised that it went back this far, but there was an article on aging and death in the American Psychologist in 1896. They think the first dissertation on aging was actually written by a woman and was about slower maze learning in older rats, 1915. So slowing down is, as you'll see, is a major theme of psychology and aging. Gus Hall, mostly known for contributions to undergraduate teaching in psychology. There's actually awards named after him for the teaching of psychology. Did write a book, I think later on in his own life, called Senescence, the Second Half of Life. I don't think at that point in time that senescence necessarily implied senility, but the unfortunate overlap of the terms of shadowed geropsychology and other disciplines in aging well into the 1970s, actually. One of the earliest examples we can find of the practice of psychology of aging was up in the Bay Area. Lillian Martin was a psychologist back in the 20s that did counseling with older adults. It mostly had a kind of positive thinking, restructuring your negative thoughts about aging sort of flavor to it. The first identified lab in psychology and aging was Walter Miles up at Stanford. Kind of interesting that some of the same locations still figure majorly, even though not continuously. It operated from about 27 to 32 and then stopped. Public Health Service research started in 1941. Started again after the war. Jim Buren actually was one of the first people involved in that lab, and that's where he got his start. It was 1 or 2 years ago. Jim celebrated his 90th birthday here, and he did this kind of reminiscence of his career in aging, which was just an amazing experience. I hope they got it on tape, recorded it for us. But one of the things that he talked about was the way that our thinking about some issues has changed so much. And they actually had results back in the late 40s showing that there was some link between psychological stress and heart disease. And the NIH embargoed the paper because nobody could believe that was possible. So how much we've changed our attitudes towards them. APA's Division for Adult Development and Aging, Division 20, was organized right after World War II, as was the Gerontological Society of America. There was a kind of a whole wave of activity about retirement and older adults right after World War II in the United States. It was actually originally called the Division of Maturity, and then later they broadened it out to Adult Development and Aging. First textbook was written in '64 by Jim, who was the first dean here at the Davis School. The NIA was founded in 1975. Robert Butler, who was here in the recent past, he's now has a longevity center in New York, but he was the first executive director of the National Institute on Aging. He was a psychiatrist, actually, working with older adults, with a strong interest in life review, among other things. The first training conference on training psychologists to work with older adults was in 1981. A lot of the people that were there, well, first of all, let me back up and say it was held in Boulder, Colorado, which was also the site of an early training conference for clinical psychology in general. That's where the scientist practitioner model for clinical psych training was developed. So the 81 conference became somewhat cutely known as Older Boulder. And people, actually I think people tend to underestimate the impact of the conference, but the primary focus of the 81 conference is kind of on defining what the knowledge base was in psychology and aging. But one of the things that actually came out of the conference was the APA level journal, Psychology and Aging, was then established a few years later. Apparently, Powell Lawton and Saltell's book that you have for the class, was sitting on the steps one morning brooding about something and got into a talk with a couple of the other senior people in geropsychology, and Powell said, well, nothing's really going to happen in this field unless we get our own journal. It happened that Gary Vandenbos, who is involved with APA publications, was there, and he and 2 or 3 other people got their heads together and started the journal a few years later. It actually did make a huge difference in the field because in the late 70s and earlier part of the 80s, it was not uncommon for people doing research on psychology and aging and submitting papers to other American Psychological Association journals to get those papers rejected because age was not randomly assigned. And you've got to take a bunch of people and you randomly assign some of them to the old group and some of them, you know, you heard me right. You know. 92, there was a second training conference. This was actually sort of co-sponsored by the Administration on Aging and the National Institute of Mental Health. The part of the National Institute of Mental Health, which just a couple of years later spun off and became the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. So it was a more kind of training and services arm. It was actually primarily motivated by the people in Washington at the 2 federal agencies. Got known as Older Boulder 2 in spite of the fact that it took place in Washington, D.C. We liked the name a lot, so we didn't really want to give up on the name just because of geography. It was more focused on, I think the 2 things that the 92 conference did is it changed around some of the pessimism that had characterized people's reactions to the 81 conference, and also focused more on skills training for psychologists. So 81 sort of did the knowledge base. The 92 conference started talking more about, well, what are the skills that professional psychologists need in assessment and training? And one of the things that people realized that kind of turned the tide is people have been pessimistic about the 81 conference because there hadn't been a lot of growth in doctoral programs in graduate schools of psychology focused on aging. What people realized in 92 is that there had been a lot of growth in clinical internships and clinically oriented postdocs in the intervening decade, and that a lot of the activity was actually kind of going on at that level. In 1997, Norman Abels, who's a clinical geropsychologist who just recently retired from Michigan State University, became president of APA. His election as president of APA had more to do with his activity in APA politics and with the fact that he was interested in aging. But the fact that he was interested in aging really turned around APA's commitment to aging. There were several products of his term, including a pamphlet that's still renewed and reissued every few years called What Psychologists Need to Know About Aging, to work with older adults. There was also a group that worked on dementia assessment and issued some guidelines for dementia assessment, and in a more ongoing way, picking up on some work that had been kind of going on under a task force that he had initiated a little earlier on. They actually founded the APA Committee on Aging, which was part of Psychology Association governance, and then also had an office staff person